Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone. As we said, my plan is to speak for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then open things up for question. I will keep an eye on the Q&A window there, and if I see something that's appropriate to address as my talk goes forward, I'll do so. Otherwise, I'll take most of the questions at the end. Let me start just with a few words of introduction, or rather, to put it more correctly, a few words of shameless self-promotion. I'm a historian. My main area of research is the history of Poland, specifically the history of Catholicism, Christianity in Poland. And I teach courses on these topics here at the University of Michigan. I've been doing this for about 20 years, and I've been using clickers in my classroom for about five years now, I believe. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit about sort of some more general issues about lecturing and teaching in large classrooms, and then explain how I have come to use clickers in the classroom to enhance my lecturing technique. Now, I want to start with some pedagogical heresy, I think, by saying that, in my opinion, lecturing is okay. In fact, it's, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, it's sometimes necessary, but it's even more than that. It's something we shouldn't necessarily write off as an old-fashioned, ineffective pedagogical tool. And there's a few reasons that I say that. First of all, I see from some of the introductions that people are coming to this from a wide variety of disciplines, the sciences, the humanities, the social sciences, and in different fields there are different degrees of expository presentation that are just intrinsic to the nature of the disciplines. And some of us simply cannot avoid a certain amount of this. Now, I'll be the first to admit that saying, oh, my discipline is special, I need to lecture, is often an excuse to avoid experimenting with new teaching methods. Nonetheless, though, I think there are some differences, disciplinary differences, that require some of us to talk a little more than others. Second, I think it's entirely appropriate for us to recognize that we all have different skill sets. Some professors are dynamic, engaging public speakers, others are quiet, reserved, but masterful at steering a discussion section. A truly good teacher needs a range of approaches to be really effective, but there's nothing necessarily wrong to playing to our strengths as long as we don't use that as an excuse to avoid trying new things. Third, there are just logistical and institutional constraints on how we teach. A simple thing, like the nature of the classroom one gets assigned. If there are movable seats, if there are fixed chairs or fixed desks, that can make a huge difference in the pedagogical approach we need to adopt. Now, we should complain about being assigned excessively large class sizes, being assigned rooms that are not appropriate to some forms of dynamic teaching. But complain as we might, we still have to deal with the situation that's given us. But finally, and this is the most important point I want to make, I think that there has been a tendency over the last decade or so, perhaps even longer, to dismiss the lecture as a teaching format, to criticize it to the point of delegitimizing it entirely. And I think that this overlooks the fact that the ability to acquire and to retain, importantly, information through listening is actually a very, very important skill. Important in many ways as reading is. In the so-called real world, people have to listen to spoken exposition all the time. And any of you who've had any experience in the business world will know that some of the presentations they have to listen to are a lot more boring than most of the stuff that we feed them in college. When students can't read effectively, if they can't retain what they read, our very appropriate response is to try to figure out how to write better so that they can understand us, and more importantly, in our role as teachers, to teach students how to read more effectively. That's taken for granted as one of our roles. But when we're faced with students who have trouble acquiring information when it is presented verbally, our challenge ought to be exactly the same, to figure out how to give better and more effective lectures, but then also how to teach successful listening skills. And if you agree with me, if you're with me so far on all of that, then I think the next thing to address is how can we go about becoming more effective lecturers, maximizing the learning for our students and preparing them for receiving information orally in the future. My defense of the lecture as a genre doesn't mean that I'm complacent about the professor who just reads verbatim the same notes in a monotone without making eye contact with the students. Of course, we want to dispense with that old format. But it is possible, I'm convinced, to construct lectures in a way that encourages student engagement. The foundation of my whole, the premise under everything I'm saying today is the idea that students can be taught the skill of active listening, and that they can be engaged in a lecture even if the instructor is doing the talking. Now, of course, it goes without saying, technology is never a panacea in matters like this. But there is no doubt that we do have some pieces of technology at our disposal nowadays that give us some options in lecturing more effectively. And I think one of these is, in fact, the eye clicker that I'm going to be talking about now. Now, I'm not going to go into any of the technical matters. I just suffice it to say, for those of you who've not used the eye clicker before, they're very, very, very simple, both for students and for instructors. The students have to buy one of these clickers. Here at the University of Michigan, they cost about $30, a little more than that, I think. There's a market of used clickers for half that price. Students then have to register the clicker. Each one of them has a little code on the back where you can do that. And once they do so, that's all they have to worry about. Here at U of M, the software works through our course registration system, pairing up individual clickers with individual students in specific courses. It's all automated. And the older model of the clickers are incredibly simple. They have A, B, C, D, or E to answer a question. That's it. Some of the newer models do allow for a little bit of additional forms of input. But regardless, it's quite easy. Now, for instructors, it's equally simple. You just plug in the base station. You see a picture of an old base station there on this slide. Newer ones are a little bit differently designed, but they have the same features. Once you launch the necessary software and enter in some basic data for the course that you're teaching, then a little box shows up on your screen. It might look like this, or depending on which version of the software you're using, it might look a little different, but it's basically the same. And that allows you to start receiving answers from the students, and then to display those answers. Now you can ask a student a question verbally. You can prepare it on a PowerPoint presentation. You can bring up a website. Whatever is happening on your screen is independent from the clicker, which allows people a lot of flexibility. That's a nice feature. Now, the software will record every student's answers and then later can give you all sorts of statistics about how the question was answered. The basic statistics actually show up on the base station itself. Now, this is something only the instructor can see, but on the little window on the base station, you can see how the students are responding to the questions in real time, which answers they're giving, you know, as a percentage, which percentage of the total answers are going to a particular question, how long it's taking them, and how many of them have answered. It's as I say, it's all quite simple and very, very revealing. You can watch how long they take to answer the question, which gives you some hint as to how hard the question was for them. If you really want to, you can go deeper into the software, a program called iGrader, and get all sorts of detailed information, including how long each individual student took to answer each individual question, whether they changed their answer. There's a lot of information you can get. If you don't want to worry about that, you don't have to, but it's there for those who wish to use it. Now, I've introduced clickers into my lectures in two different ways, and I think that my classroom engagement has improved dramatically as a result. I use clickers for anonymous questions, and I use clickers for quizzes, going so far as to totally replace other forms of examination, and I'll explain and defend that strategy as I go forward. But first, let me talk a little bit, before I get into the use of the clicker for graded work, let me talk a little bit about the use of it in anonymous discussion questions, because this gets very directly to the level of engagement in answer to Mark's question. It gives me some direct feedback on the level of engagement the students are presenting in the class. So just to give you one example, thanks to the use of anonymous questions, I can ask for a lot of personal information that otherwise I couldn't ask. So I regularly teach a class on the history of Roman Catholicism. Now, anytime you teach religion, particularly at a state school, you're treading on some, on some thin ice, and so one has to be quite careful. Asking about their knowledge of the topic, for example. Now, this goes beyond teaching on religion for any topic. To ask the student how much you know about a particular topic, getting a correct answer from them is very tricky. They often either understate or overstate how much they know coming into the class. Well, by using the clickers, I can get a sense of where they think they stand without them having to expose that individually to any of the other students. Knowing this helps me better customize my lectures to the level where the students are going in. Even more valuable to me was has been the ability to ask questions about who the students are. Now, this is a question you could never ask, certainly not at a state school. I can't ask the students to self-identify in their religious identity. And so that always was a problem for me, because I didn't know if I kind of assumed that the students most likely to take a course on the history of the Roman Catholic Church would be themselves Catholic. I assumed that, but I never knew. And with the using the clickers, I could find out. I could find out that about half the class considered themselves lapsed Catholics or former Catholics, and that only 10% were practicing Roman Catholics. This was quite an important revelation for me, and it really changed the way that I prepared the class, because I knew what sort of audience I was dealing with. But the real benefit of the anonymity feature is that you can ask questions that lead to open discussion, whether it be literally discussion or indirect discussion. This is where we start to talk about engagement. So, for example, another class that I teach from time to time is a survey of the history of Poland. So on the very first day of class, I can ask a question like this: when should the class start? When does the history of Poland begin? There's no right answer, obviously, to a question like that. It's something that you can talk about. And I know from experience that if I ask a question like this, particularly on the first day of class, students are very shy, students are unsure of themselves, and the first, somebody, whoever is the most aggressive among them, will come up with an answer, and then that will become the sort of focal point of the conversation from there on. If I use the clickers, I can get a sense of a broader distribution of answers. This is particularly valuable when it comes to maybe more politically sensitive topics where students might be embarrassed to give this or that answer. I can get a sense of where they are. And the students have reported to me, now I only have anecdotal evidence on this, but students have reported to me that the periodic use of questions like these, even if the question itself does not actually then go on to lead to a discussion, it brings the students into the lecture. It makes them feel that they're connected to it. So that I will scatter questions like these throughout my presentation, sometimes saying afterwards, okay, now turn to the people around you and let's talk about this for 5 minutes. Or would anyone in the class like to defend the answer they gave to the question, or something like that. But often I won't. Sometimes I'll do that, sometimes I won't. But even if I don't, this brings the students into an active participation, an active engagement with the material in the class. Another way that I'll use this is to take a survey, for example. Taking my Polish history class, I'll take a survey that was given in Poland to Poles. But before I tell the students how the Poles responded to it, I'll ask them to respond to it. And then we can compare their answers to the answers of people in Poland. And very often there are huge differences, which really brings home to the students the importance of cultural context in thinking about a lot of these questions. You can do some really interesting things with this this regard. I often use it for politically sensitive topics and to bring in external material. So here's I was lecturing on the history of socialism in a different class, showed the students this this website with a rather stark opinion, and then I could follow this up with a question. So what do you think about that particular blog's argument that Barack Obama is a socialist? And then this could lead to a very interesting discussion. And then we can go on from that to actually talk about, as I did in this particular class, the writings of Karl Marx and Engels and others. So I could use this as a way of confronting their preconceptions about that particular ideological formation with some of the formation's founding texts, making a link, establishing a link between the stuff that is just floating out there on the web and their own views and the material that we're covering in the class. Now, of course, I could do all of this without the clicker as well, but by introducing their response, an active response, even if the activity is no more than clicking on something, the active response brings them into this exchange in a much more effective way. Now, another way I can use the anonymity picture, and the final way that I can, is to introduce questions about how the class is going. I can do on-the-fly course evaluations, informal ones, to know about even a particular lecture if I'm unsure about dealing with a complex issue, if it's been understood, these sorts of questions. And I did ask at one point in one particularly large class, I think this one had about 225 students, I asked, so what's your opinion of the way the clickers are being used in this class? Do you like the way that we're having these quizzes? Or do you prefer an old-fashioned exam format? And as you can see, the answers were pretty decisive in favor of the clickers. And that brings me to the other type of, the other use that I have for the clickers, and the primary one actually, and that is quizzes. So I've really taken the plunge here. I have abandoned traditional paper exams altogether in my large lecture classes. Still use them in some of my smaller classes, but in my large classes, I have abandoned them in favor of the use of clickers. I use clickers generally for about a quarter of the grade. Depending on the details of the class, it might be a little more or a little less, but about a quarter of the grade. That's an important percentage, and it's not just a sort of wildly chosen one. It's a well-considered one. I always tell the students that learning history is not about learning names and dates. Quite the contrary. It's all about analysis. It's all about interpretation. That's what history is. However, I also want to emphasize to them that the storing a certain amount of just basic knowledge, names and dates and places and things like that, is a part of what we do. You can't do any interesting analysis or interpretation unless you have a little bit of knowledge at your disposal. And I think that about 25% of what we do as historians involves the storage of information in our brains for recall, for effective recall. And so I'm comfortable making that about 25% of their grade. The rest of their grade comes from various types of written projects, more analytical things. Now, many people have argued, and I'm sure that many of you have encountered this point of view, that these devices, these clickers, can't really be used for a meaningful percentage of a student's grade. That 25% way too much. When I first adopted the clickers, I remember being told by someone here on campus that clickers, oh, you can use it for a symbolic percentage of your grade, but don't make it worth all that much. Well, I have found I do not find the arguments to support that point of view to be very convincing. There are a couple of arguments that are advanced to support the idea that you can't use this for real grades. The first is cheating. The idea is that the clicker makes it too easy to cheat. Well, I don't believe this is the case. At least it hasn't been the case for me, and I can demonstrate that. So I did a little back-of-the-envelope study by comparing the grade distribution in classes where I used clickers for grading and in classes where I didn't, and I took a bunch of classes, and I came up with this. So what we see here is that the students do a little bit worse when using clickers as opposed to traditional exams. So what does this mean? Well, you can interpret this in a number of ways. You could say that my students just haven't figured out how to cheat on the clickers yet, and they had well mastered the techniques of cheating on traditional exams. You could say that they're cheating on both and that their effectiveness is equal in both types of assessment. Or you could assume, as I like to do with being the Pollyannish optimist that I am, that the students are being pretty honest. I don't know which of those interpretations is true, but whichever one you want to adopt, it seems pretty clear to me that in my experience, there certainly is not more cheating going on with clickers than with traditional paper exams, that it is more or less the same. There is a certain little psychological game that I play with the students, and I'll admit that right out, that I make this pitch to them and I show them this very chart, which is legit. I'm not making this up. This is legitimate, legitimate statistics from my teaching experience. But I show the students this at the beginning of classes, and always come to the punchline that, so you can see that at least here at the University of Michigan, there isn't a lot of cheating going on with clickers. Now, of course, that's a bit of a leap to that decisive conclusion, but as I'm sure many of you know, when you can establish in the students' minds the idea that the norm is not to cheat, then cheating will go down. Many studies have shown that. And this is my way of doing that. And I received some interesting, recently, some interesting support for this. So this particular semester, I decided to loosen up a little bit when students come to me and say, my battery died. Okay, it's possible that happens, but the only thing that can go wrong with a clicker, because they're pretty simple devices, batteries do die. So I decided, okay, well, if students say that their batteries died and they come up to me before class, I'll let that happen once every semester, and then I tell them, just write down your answers on a piece of paper and give me the piece of paper after class. Now, there is not an easier way to cheat under that scenario, because I actually give the students the answers to the question, as I'll tell you about in a moment. Nonetheless, I have noticed this semester, when students turn in papers with their answers written, they have mistakes that they themselves check and note were incorrect. It happens very, very frequently. I was quite startled. It was really a very lovely development that I could see that not just a few students, but quite consistently, the students are behaving honestly with these things. And I think one of the reasons that that is so is that they have come to understand, and I constantly reiterate this point, that these tests, these quizzes, I should say, are not so much about assessment in my mind, even though they do have a role to play in their grade, but they are actually about learning. That, to be honest, I don't care much about assessment. I realize that it's important to the administration of my university, it's important to my students, and I will give careful assessments to my students. That's fine. But it's not something I care about. I care about teaching. I care about their learning. And whatever grade we assign to it in the end is way down the list of things that I'm concerned about. I'm more concerned directly about what is actually being taught. And this is where the clickers really come into their own. As I'm sure most of you know, there are countless studies proving beyond any doubt that the midterm final assessment mechanism is really, really ineffective. That when we have 2 or 3 tests over the course of a semester, students cram to learn the material and forget it within about 48 hours. Long-term learning off of that measure of assessment is minimal. In other words, using midterms and finals to measure students' performance might effectively measure something, but it isn't measuring long-term learning, and it isn't encouraging long-term learning at all. On the other hand, daily or very frequent quizzes have been shown to have an enormous impact on long-term learning. And so that is what I've always wanted to introduce in my classes. But of course, when you have a large class, even if you have teaching assistants, you can't give daily quizzes. It's just not possible to grade that many exams, even if they're rather short. The clickers allow you to do this automatically. And so the issue of the time is solved. And it really frees you up to do some very interesting things. Let me tell you about some of the things that I do with these quizzes. Now, of course, a large percentage of the questions are always going to be pretty straightforward, invariably. That's just, obvious. But you can also do a lot of interesting things because of the format of the clicker that you couldn't do with a pen and paper exam. And these other ways of developing questions actually are directed towards improving learning, not just improving assessment. So, for example, you can bring together the visual and the textual in interesting ways. So here in this particular question, pulled out of a Polish history class I teach. Now, one big problem that I have with teaching Polish history is that the names are very challenging for people who don't know Polish. It's very hard for most Anglophones to remember these long multisyllabic consonant-filled names. If one of the ways that I can help them do this is to allow them to use multiple forms of recollection. So by combining the visual and the text. So when I lectured about Tchaikovsky, the correct answer is C, for those of you who are interested, or the two of you who might be interested in this. When I was lecturing about Tchaikovsky, I put this poster up on a slide behind me, and I talked about it. It was a poster showing the economic development plans from the 1930s and how they would project into the future. And then they had this visual reference in connection with the name before. Now I present them with the same visual reference as a cue while giving the test. The act of developing this question simultaneously reinforces that double grounding, both textual and visual, of the piece of information that I want them to stick in their memories. And I have found that this really works. Even on a relatively difficult question like this, a person who's not terribly famous with a difficult name, I found that I can go back maybe 4 or 5 weeks later, ask the same question again, and they'll still get it right. Not quite in the same percentage, but in a very large percentage. Even so, in fact, just yesterday in class, I gave a whole bunch of questions that I pulled out from January. Questions I'd given in quizzes in January. Questions that back then, large majorities of the students got right. I asked the question again, and in every case, let's say there were 3 questions yesterday that were pulled from January. In all 3 questions, at least 70% of the students still knew the material, still got the answer right. Now that to me is really satisfying. That shows that some learning actually took place. They've retained that information. They didn't study for it. They didn't know this was coming. Usually my questions are of the material for this week. So the fact that they could pull that out of their mind and still answer the questions right, that many months later, that I think is really powerful evidence that a different type of learning is going on, that these quizzes are teaching them, not merely assessing them. Okay? Since I teach a lot of historical texts, this type of question has proven to be very useful for me. So I'll pull a quotation, a representative quotation, out of a text that the students have been assigned to read, and then ask them who wrote it. It's the first time they're presented with a question like this, they often stumble because something I've long noticed is students often are not taught prior to coming to university, are not taught to pay attention to the author of a text that they've been assigned to read, and they often don't recall that. They don't notice it even. Well, they have to, by giving them these kind of questions, I certainly teach them that they ought to pay attention to that. But more importantly, more substantively, by preparing a question like this, I'm modeling the identification of a representative quotation, something I'm always trying to get the students to do. So and then talk to them about how one goes about selecting such a quotation. So I don't just merely give the question, but then later I will talk about why I chose that particular quotation, why I believe that that quotation summarized the broader argument in the text that they had been assigned. And by pairing a question like this with some more elaborate teaching about sort of higher level reading skills, we can really accomplish some important goals. One of my favorite sort of style of question, type of question, is this "what was I talking about?" question. So here's a picture that I showed, a painting that I showed in one particular class, and I had talked about what this painting represented. Then, 10 minutes later, I gave them a quiz on which they found this question. Now, all of the possible answers are correct statements, right? But I was only talking about one of them. Now, this is something that really disconcerts the students when they first encounter it. But what I'm trying to convey to them is that when I show an image, the image is meant to stand for a point that I'm trying to make in class. And I'm trying to get them to activate the oral listening skills with the visual memory skills. And I'm also, to be honest, trying to make sure they pay attention. This generated one of the best negative student evaluations I've ever received. On one course evaluation at the end of the semester, a student gave me very low scores and said, I particularly hated the use of the clickers because they forced me to pay attention to the entire class. Needless to say, I wasn't terribly sympathetic to that complaint. I do think it is, in fact, true. I've had fewer problems with students attempting to multitask simply because at any moment I might pull out a clicker question and ask them, what was I just talking about? And they have to be on their toes. But yet I don't have to resort to the very unpleasant and I think counterproductive technique of calling on students, calling them out for their lack of attention. It's less direct. There's no public embarrassment involved, but there's a consequence, and so they must pay closer attention. Of course, I've not eliminated the problem of students hiding their cell phones on their smartphones on their lap and still doing some multitasking. I think that's probably an impossible goal, as much as we try. But I do believe that using this type of question from time to time keeps them on their toes and forces them to remain engaged. If you develop questions with care, you can also even bring in some higher order learning skills, higher order thinking. So here's another question that I asked in 20th century Polish history. So they're presented with a poster that's in two languages. It's in Polish and in German, and the message is the same in both languages. It says, "We vote for Poland." So clearly, it's talking about some sort of plebiscite. I had lectured about the process of creating a Polish state in 1918 and explaining how some parts of the country, the boundaries, were determined by votes among the local populations to which country they wanted to belong to. So when presented with this question, the students first had to think about, okay, where in Poland were there Germans and Poles living side by side, so that you'd need a poster like this. And then of those places, where was there actually a plebiscite? And if they had been doing their work, and if they had looked at the map, and I had, of course, worked with them on some points of geography earlier, they would be able to give the correct answer of Katowice. But it required several steps of reasoning to do it. So it's a useful form of questioning. Speaking of this, I do a lot of geography with these clicker quizzes. So here's another one from a general modern Europe class. Which of these maps shows the situation in Europe in 1930? This is a type of question that the first time I present it to students always causes them a lot of anxiety. They don't get a lot of geography in high school for the most part, and we try to deal with this, but it's an ongoing struggle. By presenting students with plenty of maps and by encouraging them to make sure they're up on the major cities and boundaries and things like that, and then quizzing them on in this way, I found that I can solidify some of the geographical knowledge they didn't get in secondary school. Now, the bottom line to all of this is that it creates opportunities for not just, as I said, assessment, but for a new type of student engagement. After I give the clicker quiz, I'll tell them the answer. And then I might explain why I devised the question the way I did. I like to be as explicit as possible about my goals and my thinking in developing my pedagogical techniques. I can talk to them about why a particular answer was right, why particular other answers were wrong, and then learning happens. I can, of course, also catch myself, and this happens quite frequently. A student will say, will come back to me and say, well, I thought it was a different answer, and here's why I gave that answer. Perhaps that shows me that I failed in a bit of my teaching, that there was a gap of a misunderstanding that I needed to clear up. If I give a question and most of the students get it wrong, I figure that's got to be my fault, not theirs. So I'll maybe not count that question or give the question again. I usually give questions more than once if many students miss them. And so we can have this back and forth on a question by question basis in a way that makes this so much more effective as a learning tool than any other form of exam could be. I tell the students that they need to study differently if they want to be effective in a class structured in this way. And students have reported to me on course evaluation that they do change their studying techniques, and that it's this change in studying that really makes the big difference for them. The pitch I give to the students is that learning in any field is very similar to learning how to play a musical instrument or how to master a sport, right? You can't just practice the night before the concert or the night before the game and hope to do well. Nobody would try that. Well, it's the same in the classroom, I tell the students. You need to study a little bit every day. I said, give my classes 20 minutes of your time every single day, and you will have no problem on these quizzes. And then we talk a little more in greater depth about exactly how they should spend that 20 minutes a day, what exactly they should do for effective studying, and thinking of studying as a form of practice, right? As opposed to studying as they conventionally think of it, I think leads to much better learning outcomes. So just to sum up, students' responses to this method have been very, very positive. Here's just a few examples. Students admitting that they struggled with them, but still feeling that they gained from the process. Students being generally very, very enthusiastic about this technique, and I, after doing this now for several years, have become firmly convinced that this is an effective way to teach. So with that, I would be delighted to take your questions. I see that there's one that just appeared. Yes, when I'm giving a quiz for evaluation purposes, I do not allow interaction amongst the students. I tell them that for that moment we have to be quiet. But then immediately after I give the answer, then we can go into some more active discussion. It might be as an entire class, or it might be with smaller groups among the students, asking them to talk over certain exam answers. I'll also often take a short break in my presentation after giving a quiz, at which point they will just independently talk to each other about the answers. I'm not sure that I understand the first question that Matt has posed, but the in-class quizzes I'm talking about, the 25%, are precisely these type of questions that I've been asking here. As to how many questions, that'll vary. On average, about 5. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Sometimes I will just simply stop and give a question and then move on. I try often to interspace quizzes, maybe a couple questions and then more lecturing, a couple more questions. Although I have to admit that more often than not, I'm lazy to just do all at once. I see I'm getting a lot of questions here. I will try to answer as many as I can. I was asked what the other 75% of my grading is. Well, that'll vary somewhat from class to class. But usually at least half of the grade comes from written assignments that the students do at home. I use a lot of blogging, a lot of writing work that they have to do. If it's a very large class and I have discussion sections with a teaching assistant, then there's of course some grade that comes from that as well. So that will be varied. So do I run the quizzes on the readings or on the content of the lecture or both? Well, the answer is both. Both and everything, the readings, the quizzes. I will often deliberately not mention something that was brought up in the readings and then bring it on the quiz just to keep them reminded that they have to do the reading as well as the lectures. The question from Lance about the type of questions that we can ask. So we at Michigan have not yet adopted the most recent version of the iClicker, which does allow for open-ended questions. Once we do, I'm eager to try that. I don't know that it's going to make all that much difference, but it certainly will open up possibilities for new types of questions. As it stands right now, the technology that we're using here at U of M only permits the use of multiple choice questions. But I'm less hostile to this style of questioning than I used to be. I think I've come to realize that if you take the time and effort, and it does take time and effort, believe me, to come up with good questions, effective, well thought out questions, even multiple choice questions can achieve quite a number of goals. So how long does it take me to write a question? Yeah, right. I wouldn't do it on the fly. I wouldn't. I give this a lot of thought, and it varies, of course. And I often recycle some questions from previous semesters, although I try not to do too much of that. Yeah, it takes time. There's no question about it. Even just a simple quiz of 4 or 5 or 6 questions can take 45 minutes of time if you're really thinking about it. There's no rule, but it's definitely not something. It's not something to be taken lightly. You have to recognize that it will take time. I actually wouldn't recommend doing this for a class someone has never taught before. I mean, in each case, I introduced this to classes that I already had mostly developed because there was a big time investment in rethinking some of these techniques. So what do I do to prevent cheating? Well, aside from the method I mentioned earlier about just simply trying to convey a norm of honesty, which I found to be pretty effective, of course, I tell them to close their notebooks, close their computers before the exam starts. I have my teaching assistants walk the aisles during the quizzes. And of course, I'm keeping a close eye on things. I haven't had to. The largest class I've taught that I teach is around 250 students. Clearly, this would become more of a problem when classes get even larger, up to 500 students, as I know some of my colleagues have to deal with. But I think that just the simple methods of observance have kept the grades in the range I expect them to be. And as long as the grade distribution looks more or less like what I would expect it to be, then I figure if there's cheating going on, it's not enough to distort the overall results, and I'm not going to get too bent out of shape about it. The question about participation and performance points. What I always do is everybody who even takes the quiz on a particular day gets a point right off. And then there are other points for each correct answer. So just being there, even if they answer all the questions wrong, will get them some credit. Let's see. I have actually not attempted to use tablets or any more elaborated forms of feedback. This is simply just because I haven't yet had the time and occasion to experiment with it, but I'm very excited about some of the technology that I've seen. I think one of my concerns, though, and this is a pretty major concern that I have, not all of my students have access to even laptops, let alone iPads or other forms of tablets. Michigan doesn't provide their students with those kind of computer resources. Now, I recognize that the majority of my students, the overwhelming majority, have these technologies, but I just, even if it's only a small handful of students who don't own the relevant technology, I would be very nervous about asking them to buy an expensive piece of technology for classroom use. That's just my own point of view. Asking if I've ever caught one student with multiple clickers. I have not. I do watch for this, and I instruct my teaching assistants to watch for this. It's entirely possible. I can't prevent everything, but again, as long as the numbers suggest that the general class results are about what I want, I'm okay with that. Oh, there's a good question about using clickers for smaller classes. I only tried this once, and I think it really does have a use, and I'm going to work on this more in the future. It's a little awkward, right? Precisely because there's something so, I don't know, formulaic about a multiple choice question when you're in a seminar setting. So for that reason, I've not used it much, but when I did try it, it did bring up some voices that I wasn't otherwise hearing in the seminar. So that's I think a really important thing about the clickers, especially when you use it for non-graded questions, anonymous questions. You can hear voices that would otherwise be hesitant to speak. And that's a huge asset that I really like. Oh, how do I deal with the length of time? So I have a very simple technique. I watch the answers come in. So you can see if you look at the base station, the clicker base station, you can see how many students have answered the question. And I wait until nobody is answering, until they've stopped answering and the numbers are no longer moving. And then I count slowly in my head to 15. That's my technique. So I give lots of extra time for students to think about their answers, change their answers, or for some of the slower students to answer. This policy I worked up in consultation with the Office of Disabilities here at the university. When I first did this, I went to them to talk to them about the issue of how do I deal with, how do I deal with students who I typically would give extra time for. And we came up with this. This basically ends up being like adding 30–40% extra time on a quiz or exam by using that technique. Well, okay, yes, quizzes are formalized, but we don't need proctors other than the teaching assistants that are already in the room for a large class. It actually involves fewer resources in terms of time because it's all, and this answers another question someone posed, it's all automatic. That's the beauty of it. The quizzes are automatically uploaded into our course management software. So there's nothing else I have to do. It's right there. The students can see their results right away. Check on them anytime. There's no extra effort involved. I've been able to give more time to the more substantive elements of grading, so like grading written work, for example, because I spend now no time on grading these more simple answers. Do I provide students with quiz questions after the quiz? I actually don't do this. I talk about it after the quiz, right? But the reason that I don't post the quizzes, I post the rest of my slides, after each class, but not the quizzes. And that's just simply because I do like to occasionally reuse questions, maybe 2 years later or something, and I'd rather not have them floating around out there. So that's all. Let's see. So I see that the main point of that question was asking them to look up if they want to look up the material later. One thing that they have done is they've asked me, just simply asked me to send them further information, and I facilitate this with a course blogging system where they can post questions like that, and often that's where that comes out. I noticed a question about have the clickers ever not worked on a given day? Yep, that there's even the simplest technology will occasionally fail. I've had that happen, and in cases like that, I just say, well, okay, no quiz today. Since I'm giving them every single day over the course of a 13-week semester, it's 26 classes or more. Depending on the scheduling, and so if I miss one, it's no big deal. The only problem that I've had, as I think I mentioned earlier, is that occasionally batteries do die, and so we deal with that when it happens, but it's not a big problem. But these things are pretty foolproof. Now, earlier, before Michigan embraced the iClickers, we used a different type of clicker, the name of which shall not be mentioned, that they broke. They broke a lot. There were a lot of technological snafus. Since moving over to the iClicker system, and now that's been, I guess, 5 years, if memory serves, maybe 6, we've had no problems. I've personally had no problems at all. Certainly not systematic. Oh yes, I forgot my clicker. Sure, it happens, and I use the same technique. I figure anybody can screw up once, and so I use that technique of once every student can come to me with that line, and then I just tell them, write it down on a piece of paper. And as I mentioned earlier, it is amazing that students will do that and consistently grade themselves wrong, mark wrong answers, even though there's no way of me enforcing their honesty in cases like that. So my generosity in this regard seems to be rewarded, and I know that occasionally I'm the sucker and they're pulling one off on me, but I don't care. It doesn't end up mattering in a way that is significant over the long run. So it's been quite a flurry of questions between the open Q&A and the chat room. I think I've answered. Oh, yep, one more just popped up. Do I drop quizzes at the end of the semester? Yes, I do. Or rather, not quite. What I do is this. I think I mentioned earlier, I have an average of 5 questions a day. So what I do at the end of the semester is I add 5 points to everybody's quiz score, everybody's. So that if they had a bad day, if they missed a day, if they just want some bonus points, everybody gets them. So they all get 1 missed class with no penalty. Then I also create opportunities for bonus work, a little bit of bonus work that they can then do to make up for. I've gone back and forth, either 1 additional quiz day or 2 additional quiz days. I'm not sure. I'm no more than that though. I don't want it to get out of control, but I do let them have a few bonus points. So basically, they can miss up to 3 days of class and still recover from it. And I think that's about right. You get much more than that, and you're really digging into the total amount of time in the semester, and that's not productive. So.
All right, great. I did see one other question. Do your quiz scores go directly into an electronic grade book?
Oh, yes, they absolutely do. Directly, well, as I have to take 1 step in between. That is, I have to open up this little piece of software called iGrader, and then I have to tell iGrader what the right answers are. Once I've done that, I then just click upload and or sync, I guess it says, and they're synced. That's all there is to it. So simple.
All right, I'm just looking through the chat to make sure we didn't miss any.
There's one question I'm afraid I have to confess that I don't understand. Does a software calculate point by serial scores? I don't know what that term means, I'm sorry to say. If Mark could elaborate, I could perhaps answer it. My mathematical and statistical vocabulary is sorely limited. Oh, I see. Do you inform the students up front about the 5-point bonus? Yes, I do. That's right on the syllabus. They get that from day one. They know about that.
Do you think that the perfect clicker question has a bimodal distribution of answers?
I guess that's another question I don't quite understand. What do we mean by bimodal?
Roman, can you elaborate on what you're trying to get at?
Another vocabulary failure on my part, I'm afraid.
He may be referring to a 50-50 split between two choices.
Oh, yeah. Well, I generally try to develop questions where there would not be ambiguity towards the answer. Let me explain that what I'm trying to get at with my clicker questions is a different type of learning that I'm trying to address with other assignments. So I ask questions for written responses, and that's actually the bulk of the grading I do, usually in a blogging or other online format. And those questions never have one answer. They're always about the nuances, ambiguities, uncertainties, multiple points of view. That's all that's the issue. What I'm trying to convey to the students is that that's the most important type of learning that we care about, but that we also care about a much more sort of up and down information storage type of issue. And with that in mind, I'm trying to develop clicker questions that directly address the latter category of learning and knowledge. And so I'm trying to focus on issues where there would be a right answer to the question and wrong answers to the question. And I try to take care to make sure that there aren't multiple possible correct answers. So quite the contrary.
All right. And then we did just get a question, or rather a request. Have you ever, or do you have experience giving a clicker question and having them answer on their own versus promoting peer discussion? Have you found one to be more effective than the other?
I use the peer discussion sometimes with the open-ended questions, quite often with the open-ended questions or with the survey-type questions. I haven't done that on the clicker questions precisely because I'm trying to get not at problem solving with this exercise, although you certainly could use it for that technique. That's just not what I'm trying to do with this particular approach. I'm really going after information storage, right? I'm creating a structure that will develop in the students the habit of daily studying and working on information retrieval. So it's a more individualized form of teaching and learning for that particular issue. And for the anonymous questions, to answer one of the queries that just came in, for the anonymous questions, once I click anonymous on my end, I do not receive any individualized responses. I just get the overall breakdown of the answers. So I don't use those. I don't use their responses to anonymous questions for any purpose at all. I don't even I can't even see those answers later. And to answer Margaret's question, I've been talking about multiple choices, but sometimes the number of choices isn't always 5. And so, yes, I sometimes would have yes or no questions. Rarely, though. It's a little too much guessing, I think, possibilities, and if it's just up or down. But certainly, you know, maybe there'll only be 3 good answers. Or another type of question that I've done quite often is I will give them 3 different timelines. So I'll take a bunch of events and scramble them up, and then put the correct timeline, the correct chronological order of events, and then 2 other lists in which there's some mistakes. And then I'll just have them pick out the right one. That's to encourage sort of cause and effect type thinking. And in those cases, I try not to put all 5 up there because that would get just dizzying with too many options. I have a question about using the smartphones to answer. I have not tried that. I know that it is a possibility. I've not used it, and the reason I've not used it is that I'm trying very hard to discourage the use of smartphones in class. I know that I can't entirely eliminate the tendency of students to multitask, but I'd love to minimize it as much as possible. So I'm just a little hesitant about bringing that in such a open way into my teaching. I don't feel strongly about this, and if the students came back and said it meant a lot to them and they'd really like to use that, then sure, I could do it. But that's just not my preference at this point. Also, I fear that based on the connectivity issues, it wouldn't always work well. I know that in several of the buildings here on our campus are dead zones. There are spots where you just can't get good connectivity, and so that would be another reason that might not work.
All right, and then Mark did give some background about what the biserial points are.
Oh, I see it now, yes. Ah, right. You know, as I mentioned, I don't, do you know the answer to this? Because I actually don't know if that is contained in the data that we get fed back in iGrader.
Just to give folks a background, the point biserial is a statistic calculated by Scantron machines. It simply means a high score indicates that there's a correlation between the likelihood of a student answering that given question correctly and their overall grade on the whole quiz. You know, Mark, I don't know the answer to that, but I will certainly pass along your inquiry, and I will make sure that the answer is sent to you.
I will say that there is, when you, after you run the, after you look at the sort of basic information that the iGrader interface gives you, and it's very basic, there is a file, I believe it's an Excel file that is saved on the, in a folder on your computer that you can open up, and it's just full of data. And I've not really done much with that data, but I've seen it there and been very impressed, and sort of wishing I had the statistical background to really make use of it. But there is a lot of stuff that gets recorded that I do not use.
All right. And Lynn, just to address your point about iClicker iClicker Go is dependent on a pretty solid Wi-Fi bandwidth. It can also, students can use their cellular data as well, but the poor connection may have made it a bit more difficult, especially in a large, if there's a lot of students connecting to the data. You just you need to make sure that your university has the bandwidth to support that.
That's been my problem. That's why I don't want to go in that direction. Sure. The iClickers, they're not very expensive. You know, they're little devices, and they use them, nowadays they use them in so many classes, so that it's really, I don't feel it's an imposition on the students to ask them to buy one of those little devices.